Welcome everyone to another Voices with Vervaeke. This is episode 2 of the series I'm doing with Gregg and Zachary Stein, and I'll have them just introduce that we're tackling the issues around finding a metapsychology that is true to transformation. And so last time we covered the problem of transformation. We problematized it. And this time, Gregg is going to take us into the problem of psychology. He has literally written the book on this. And he's going to take us through it. Some of you are familiar with some of this and some of the other work that Gregg and I have done together, and some of his blogs on Psychology Today that are very, they're exemplary for how briefly, but yet concisely, but nevertheless fully, they present these often complex ideas. And then we're going to start to see the connection between this quest for a metapsychology, at least in terms of the problem of psychology and the problem of transformation. So I want Gregg and Zach to both reintroduce themselves, and then we'll turn it over to Gregg, who's going to take us through things today. So perhaps we'll start with Zach, and then Gregg, you can introduce yourself and then begin.
Perfect. Oh yeah, so Zach Stein, just honored and just joyous to be with you guys in this endeavor. And yeah, we're discussing transformation, and I'm a developmental psychologist, so I've studied these things for years. And then the issues of metapsychology are near and dear to the way I think about psychology. I think it's hard to be a good psychologist if you're not also doing metapsychology. And I think Gregg will make that clear. So yeah, it feels like a perfect conversation to be in. And yeah, and I also don't know where it'll go, so that makes it exciting.
Sweet. All right, great. Thank you both. I am thrilled to be here. Let's talk about a problem that's haunted me for a long time, and I get to share some of that richness and detail. So Gregg Henriquez here, and you folks know me already, so I'm just going to jump in. So last time we started to, that we were developing a theme here. We problematize stuff. We problematize consciousness. We problematize the self. Now we've started, and John led us through a really, I think, rich articulation of some of the philosophical, empirical problems associated with transformation. So we're going to start scratching our heads about, okay, what is this? I think we wanted to undergird learning and developmental in relationship to that. So it's learning, development, and transformation. And then transformation from what to where, and who says and why. I mean, these are really, really complicated questions. And I want to put it both at an individual level, and I also think we can all agree that we want to think about this at quite a broad level. I mean, Zach, you've coined us as being in a time between worlds. I think we all, John, you talked about the need for sort of a new axial age kind of revolution.
Yep.
The sort of fifth joint point as a sort of thing for me. And it's all this like, wow, we are in a weird space, and we have to get from where we are to where we need to be in a very, very scary, hopeful, confusing, chaotic way. So this is this fascinating idea of transformation that we, have, I think, opened up. And I really look forward to us, diving in and getting entangled with. So there's that concept. I now want to connect it more to my own professional identity and frame, and then be like, well, okay, I'm going to give you a little metaphor, a little sort of visual here of 5 concepts here. I'm going to put transformation, learning, development right here. And now we're trying to say, well, how would we approach this? What would be the way in which we would want to think about the science of transformation, sort of the ethics of transformation, all of that. And I want to then anchor the concept of psychology to that. And of course, that's what we are brought together, in terms of this dialogos is fundamentally around those 2 concepts. Okay. I want to put 5 concepts in the middle for just a second. And John knows a little bit about this, but this will be new to you, Zach, a little bit. And that is that a metapsychology, at one point when I was developing sort of the unified theory, I identified 5 key concepts that were very ambiguous, that if we were going to have a coherent psychology, it needed to be about, okay, or we needed to tackle these concepts. And they're as follows: they're behavior, mind, mental processes, cognition, consciousness, and the self. Okay, so, and this was before any of my work with John. There was a period in which I was delineating. I almost sort of delineated this when I was working on my books, like, what are the 5 fucking nightmare conceptual problems that are disciplines all tangled up in behavior, mind, cognition, consciousness, and the self, afford actually a really interesting map of the core concepts that our field is entangled up with, especially, and I'm going to be emphasizing the field in terms of its institutional identity as a science, and I'll be talking about our history there. But if we put those 5 concepts, I just want to have this as a visual, sort of like, okay, we're actually really confused about what actually these concepts mean on the one hand, okay? Meaning that we, unlike, say, what is a proton, we psychologists and all the other disciplines that would be interfacing with this don't have clear definitions about what we mean by behavior, mental process, cognition, consciousness, and the self. I also then want to say that syncing up with John, and now maybe, and I feel certainly synced up with you also, Zach, is that actually there's maybe an emergent opportunity here to get much clearer on what these concepts are. Mm-hmm. And of course, John, the first series we did was on consciousness, and I certainly feel like we're synced up on a naturalistic version of what that might be, and then the self. And I've made a case, as you know, that your frame on cognition, separating out knowledge and epistemology into information processing, that 4P3R frame, is a brilliant articulation of what we actually can mean by cognition. So I think that we're, at a place now where there may be an opportunity for framing of these very, very abstract concepts. Transformation now is in reach, perhaps, but it also loops back to the topic for today, which is, well, what is the disciplinary framing that we bring to bear on the term? And at the root of them is then psychology. So there's this thing called psychology that, as an undergrad, even a high school student, I thought I knew what it meant. Okay. And then I realized, oh my God, and graduate school. And so anyway, how does that sound in terms of sort of, okay, hey, there's psychology there's transformation. There's this concept of psychology. There's this interesting relationship between these concepts. I'll come back to especially behavior and mind quite a bit, because I'm going to focus on these and get clarity about them. But just in terms of juxtaposing, hey, psychology of transformation also involves these other concepts, and we need a meta framework that at least affords us the opportunity to sense make, or at least know how we're not sense making, if it is the case that we're sort of engaged in a lot of incoherent tangle.
That was great, Gregg. Could I just, these are just sort of clarifications. In philosophy, and philosophers are the ones that invoke meta. That's
metaphysics. I was just in a call on metaphysics.
Yep. Generally, and I've been influenced by Collingwood and others in the idea that when you're talking about meta, you're typically talking about presupposition, and presupposition are assumptions that are shared by multiple, even competing or disagreeing theories. So an assumption belongs to a theory. A presupposition belongs to many different theories.
Beautiful.
And that typically what you're trying to do in any kind of meta is you're trying to get at the fundamental concepts within the fundamental presuppositions in order to clarify those presuppositions. So those 5 you laid out, they're pretty much presupposed by many different theories within psychology. And if they don't belong to any one theory, they're presupposed by many, perhaps even all, post-behaviorist theories in psychology. And therefore, by trying to examine them and clarify them, what we're doing is meta-psychology. We're not proposing a particular psychological theory. We're proposing, as you aptly put it, a framework of those presuppositions. We're trying to excavate them, explicate them, and clarify them. And that's why it's a meta-psychology. I just wanted to, just in case the language we're using isn't clear. Was that helpful, or?
That's dead on, and I hope, it makes sense to me that it might help the listeners get their coordinates of understanding, better tuned than what I was saying. But yes, that's exactly resonant with where I would frame this conversation.
Then thank you, Gregg. And then I put one more thing. The argument the problematic last time pointed to how profound a feature or process transformation is. Part of the argument that we considered, it was more of a proposal then, right, was that the standard non-developmental computational framework was inadequate, and we went through the arguments for dealing with transformation. But then if we move to a dynamical developmental framework, we're going to see that transformation and function, history and function can't be separated together. The reason I'm saying this is, again, the developmental dynamical framework is exactly that. It's a framework that can pertain to many different, even competing theories of learning, etc. Right? And so that's because it is such a fundamental framework, it needs the fundamental examination of a metapsychology to get it right. That's why the two have to be aligned together. Does that land well too with what you're proposing?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
And I was going to actually begin with it, and I alluded to this last time, and certainly, and I think we can all relate to this, but for me or my own professional identity, it relates very directly, because not only do you have the kind of the question of is and developing the proper framework, a complex dynamic developmental systems framework, but I got an acutely tossed in the deep end of the pool as a clinician.
Yeah.
That I want us to be aware of, and Zach as an educator, and you know, John in the meaning crisis, which is then the ethical layering that gets layered upon this, which is what ought transformation be oriented toward, what it be about, who has authority to make any particular kinds of claims about what kind of transformation is good or bad. And then I'm a healer. I see somebody who at a particular place. How do I decide that they are the problem? Okay. Or how do I decide that society's the problem? You know, and what kind of transformation should we be engendering? Okay. So I'll give you an example that somebody asked me about in a conversation, which is exactly this. So on the one hand, we have wisdom traditions like the Stoic tradition that really emphasizes, hey, be in control of what you can be in control of. Okay. Don't exaggerate, be tough. You know, that's a simplistic, we know that's, but there's a lot of that in Stoicism. And now we also have a social justice movement, okay, that is orienting us to be very sensitive to any possible inequity, and arguing that your obligation socially is to be anti-racist in a particular way. Okay. Now, without getting in any either or, those are actually very different messages for how to be in the world. In fact, Jonathan Haidt argues, hey, we should look to Stoicism, and we're creating victimized mentalities on the one hand. On another hand, you have, hey, there's a massive systemic racism that we all need our consciousness erased on. Okay. Those things are affording us visions of the kind of ways we ought to be, and the kinds of transformations our society needs to make. How do you know, how would you even be positioned to have an is-ought framework that would afford you the capacity to be up to the task of engaging that with a level of sophistication and depth that could do justice to its complexity? That fundamentally is the issue. And I will argue, what I'm going to do is that psychology isn't up to the task. My meta-analysis, and what I hope to walk you through, and I know that both of you offer similar kinds of critiques, so it's not going to be a hard audience to convince, but it is the case that mainstream American psychology, I will argue, is woefully under-equipped philosophically, theoretically, psychologically, and scientifically, and positioned in its place in society to do justice to the kinds of complex questions that we are facing individually, collectively, about the kinds of transformations that we need to be making.
So could I say, I think that was excellent. That's a very good point, that the job of metapsychology is not only to explicate and clarify the presuppositions of psychology to make it a better science. The job of metapsychology is also cultural ethical critique of that framework. So that would also be part of the meta aspect. Is that a fair way of representing what you've said?
100%. So for me, A metapsychology would do the justice to putting together what I would call basic psychology. That's animal behavior psychology. We'll talk a little bit about that. Human psychology, trying to describe and explain human mental behavior at particular levels. And the profession and its applications, which is then, hey, this is what you operate as a health service provider.
Right. When
you offer, I mean, Thomas Szasz calls psychiatry, psychology, secular priests at one point. Okay.
Yes.
And some people, oh, totally. I mean, actually, the correct response is not to freak out in relationship to that. The correct response is exactly, that's the point. And that's why it's woefully under-equipped to actually address what it's trying to do.
Right.
Because it's not even grounded in a proper wise theological position or philosophical. Theological, I mean that broadly. I don't mean two world ideas, but I mean wisdom, tradition, understanding that would then say, hey, this would be a wise way of going about the world. It's like, it doesn't even have a framework for actually being like, hey, let's reduce it to empirical numbers and then I'll tell you what your answer is. That's ultimately is the punchline. It's like, fuck, that's not going to cut the mustard.
So I'll say one more thing and then I'll let Zach take over with his replies, which is that the last thing you said really makes clear to me the pivotal linchpin position that wisdom has in our dialogue together, because it obviously is wisdom needs a framework of human nature broadly understood to encompass the 5 things you said. It obviously is about profound transformation, and it's also about normative improvement, virtue, ethical life. So wisdom is very much it's a concept that points to a phenomena in which all 3 of those dimensions are bound together.
100%, I believe that.
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very interesting, and I'm agreeing with everything that's being said here. Metapsychology, I like to say, is where metaphysics and psychology meet. And in the upper reaches of almost any discipline, you get the meta discipline. You can imagine a meta biology. And but what's interesting about psychology is that you're circumscribing the limits of what psychology can be and the kinds of questions like psychology is allowed to ask. So you're looking at what are the conditions for the possibility of doing a psychological science. And what's interesting is, and back to Piaget, Piaget identified the thing that psychology is working on is what he called a normative fact. So like 2 + 2 is 4.
Yep.
This is an example of a common psychological operation.
Yep.
Right. What's interesting about 2 + 2 is 4 is that it's not a causal fact. But a causal fact is like, if I hit this ball with this velocity, it will hit this other ball and that ball will go in the pocket. Right. It's a causal fact. A normative fact is different. It occurs not because of causal necessity, but because of a normative entailment.
Yep.
You say 2 + 2 is 4, not because you're caused to, but because it's correct. And so that's a very interesting phenomenon with which Piaget believed put psychology in a distinctly different stratum of scientific activity, where some of the disenchantment and reductionism that came along with the scientific paradigm in the natural sciences had to be limited, basically. And so that's kind of like, to get to this point about when we're doing psychology, we have to traffic in the normative, and we actually have to expand scientific metaphysics to include value and entailment and a few other basically facts about the mind.
Totally.
And so, yeah, psychology is interesting in that respect, that it challenges the assumed scientific metaphysics of a kind of Humean reductionist world. And so if you look for a comprehensive metaphysics that can handle both psychology and biology and physics, then you look for something like this complex, dynamical systems view of life, as it were, which is a lot where your metapsychology, as all do, Gregg, expand out beyond psychology to include these conversations about big history and the full stack of the, matter, life, mind, culture, that continuum.
Totally.
And so yeah, I think it's foundational. And then in metapsychology, you're concerned with things like the realism of our psychological constructs, right? Which is to say, do they exist, or are they basically forms of folk psychology that have been reified through statistical technique? Like, for example, grit. Grit doesn't exist in the mind the way, for example, a cognition, like broadly construed cognitions exist. Grit, it's not real. But you can reify it statistically. And so that's a result of the misapplication of certain forms of scientific practice to domains where they don't apply. And this is rampant in psychology. And it's based on a basic, I would say, metaphysical misunderstanding or category error in deep in philosophy of science. So I'm right there with you. And of course, transformation, learning, all of these things, as we talked about previously, and as you alluded to, they're normatively loaded. As an educator, a psychotherapist, an individual trying to become better, this question of what does better mean really is not simply a scientific question. So insofar as psychology claims to just be scientific, it can't tell you what's better or worse. Now, it can tell you what's healthy or unhealthy, but that's a different question. And that raises more metaphysical issues that include even philosophy of medicine and things of that nature. So yeah, we're in very deep waters. And so back to you, Gregg, in terms of where you want to kind of like bring us up.
Yeah. So then that's exactly right. I mean, it's a clusterfuck. I mean, it's an amazing entanglement, okay, of confusion. And I believe that we're actually able to disentangle a lot of entanglement but you're bringing to bear exactly what scholars for a long time have wrestled with. And so what I want to do is I want to now give the history of this thing and offer the way I parse it and then see its evolution and where it lands. Basically, and tell you what the justification of where mainstream institutional North American psychology lands. Be clear about why it lands where it does, be clear about what it's inadequate around, then thus problematize. And I want to elevate the understanding of the problem of where it got institutionalized. But anyway, John, you were going to say.
I just wanted to, just before you begin, I just wanted to chime in with what Zach said. The distinction of, and of course it is well attributed to Piaget, but it actually goes back to Plato. And it's been made famous in a debate between Dreyfus and McDowell, but there's other philosophers who talk about the space of reasons versus the space of causes.
Sure.
Right. So when I'm talking about why the rock rolled down the hill, I just have to give the causes. But when I talk about why you ran down the hill, I will give the causes, but I will also give reasons for your behavior, not just causes of your behavior. And reason, of course, and reason is this weird thing because it's supposed to describe what you're doing, but it's also inherently normative. Like Zach said, the normative facts. And even saying a normative fact is a weird, Piaget is, I think, on purpose, putting two things together that we normally don't put together in language.
Piaget coined this term normative fact. I'm referencing Piaget, but no, it's a longstanding philosophical issue, I think, of Wilfrid Sellers in particular, and the space, space of causes. And it's very subtle. And he was just trying to point out that, hey, all you psychologists, you're trafficking in an explanadome, which is fundamentally different.
So I just wanted to do that so that I could shamelessly do some self-advertising here, which is I have focused on a problem that a problematic process perhaps that I see at the center of cognition, which is relevance realization, the ability to zero in on relevance. Now, the one motive for that is just that it seems to be this fundamental process that's being presupposed in all these theories and published on that. The other motivation, and this goes to the work I'm doing with Dan Chiappi, is the notion of relevance sits between cause and reason in a very, very important way. And that's why, and if any of you have seen Untangling the World Knot or The Elusive Eye, this is why relevance is playing such a pivotal role. And so I think bringing in the dynamics, the developmental dynamics of relevance realization is going to be pertinent to trying to get, to mediate between the space of reasons and the space of causes. So sorry, that was a little bit of saying.
No, that's a very
we were
definitely connects.
We were trying to also take points where we could connect to the two previous series. And so
Totally.
that's the one on consciousness and the one on self. You can see a deeper connection running right now into this. So I just wanted to get that point out there,
Yep.
Greg, before you began.
And in both, in relevance realization, you do some very beautiful, subtle moves with that language. Realization also, in terms of to become aware of and to make happen. And it's the juxtapoint between perception and action in a particular way that creates a dynamic participatory flipping. It's beautiful. And I want to argue that that's an exemplar in my estimation. And I do try to do certain kinds of similar things ultimately down the road. And what I'm going to share, and so I get a little bit to the punchline, but then we'll come back and we'll be able to see. So right now, the science in North America, I'll just be saying psychology, but is the Institution of North American Psychology. And that's the biggest institution in psychology. So it's okay to frame it that. They produce the most textbooks, they do the most things. The science is defined as the science of behavior and mental process in about 80 to 90% of the textbooks.
Right.
Okay. That's the science of what it is. So when you ask what psychology is, that's the science. I'm going to actually take those two words and rearrange their order and talk about the science of mental behavior at a particular point.
Right.
Okay. And that juxtapose is subtle, but it actually is going to afford us a wide variety of different clarifications down the road. And I just use that then as an example of, actually subtle twists on our language with clarity about their history, and then the move in relationship to why you would do that can open up blockages in systems where before we're not. So when we just focused on relevance, but when you yoke relevance to your creative realization, all of a sudden, boom, you get an explosion of intersection between a wide variety of different perspectives that then afford intelligibility, plausibility, and coherence. And that's good. Those are good indicators to be drawn towards. So the bottom line is, so that I'll just tell that I'm not going to get into too much detail. People generally know the story, at least in these circles. I get stuck in starting to do psychotherapy, and I grow up in the idea that science is the bomb. Science, you don't know what your problems are, you apply scientific method that reveals you. Hey, does cognitive behavior therapy, we know cognitive behavior therapy works better than psychodynamic therapy. And so now you're going to go and you're going to learn that, you'll justify that, and you'll go out there and become a practitioner of empirically supported truths. That's how I entered my graduate training in psychotherapy. I got into that and realized that's actually bullshit. There's very limited, that's a very narrow and empirical brand-based argument about the nature of psychotherapy, even in the narrow confines of, psychotherapy's job is to reduce symptoms. And that's, by the way, that's the whole setup. It's like it presumes that if you're suffering, that's bad. And if you go from I'm kind of miserable to I'm really happy, you have just improved tremendously. Okay. But any thoughtful person can be like, well, wait a minute. If I told you right now, by the weekend, my entire family got killed in a car accident, but I'm cool, I'm happy. You guys be like, what the fuck's wrong with that guy? Get him to a hospital, right? So there's no way that we just look at somebody and it's like, they're happy. That's not valid. So this idea that we want people to be happy or that we want reductions in symptoms without any philosophical richness is deeply problematic. Okay. You cannot just apply the empirical methods without an enormous amount of assumptions about human nature, about social context, about values and virtue. And that's what I was told was happening. And then when I actually saw people do the work, they could come from a wide variety of different orientations and vary tremendously in terms of their skill and efficacy towards the virtuous outcome. And they could, the best of the best were good, and the lousiest of the lousy suck. And it was like, hey, what's up with that? And why don't we have a framework that affords us to understand the capacity, the validity of the insights of each of the best? That's what my intuition was. And then when I took that, I did something that actually no one else has really ever done, which was basically naive. If I had asked the questions that you guys have asked like a priori and had sort of the philosophical insights, I would have probably just been like, oh, fuck it, I can't, this is a nightmare. But what I did was I said, well, I'm a psychological doctor over here and I see all these different approaches. Why doesn't it just organize by the science of human psychology? If I go down a level, I can see that medicine is organized by the science of human biology, and engineering is organized by physics and chemistry in a particular way. And so I sort of was like, well, why aren't these different schools of thought organized by the science of human psychology? Okay. And so what I didn't realize at that time was I had been socialized as an empiricist. And now I'm going back and then basically asking the system, I was like, well, why don't I just look at the forest of what psychology is? And then that forest will then afford me the opportunity to organize the various schools of thought. Okay. And then it was in that, and in fact, at first I thought that that was going to be available. I fell into evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is the mid 1990s. Evolutionary psychology is coming along, you know, it's got Steve Pinker and Lita Cosmides, John Tooby, really interesting. And now it's anchored to an broad evolutionary view in the natural sciences that sort of made sense. And I was excited about that. But what ultimately happened was two things simultaneously. I started to see that it itself, I don't know what they mean by their terms. Okay, we'll get into what these terms are, like mind and behavior and how they frame stuff. And then ultimately, I had an insight about the concept of justification, which, by the way, relates to reasons and causes, and is going to create a very clear dividing line in what becomes a dividing line through the tree of knowledge lens between the culture, human person dimension of existence and the animal mental dimension of existence. Okay. And as I developed that line, I looked, in fact, I told all the evolutionary psych people about it when I was at their conferences. They were not too thrilled. It was really fascinating. They didn't find it to be useful at all. I'm like, actually, hey, we can bridge to social constructionists. You can do this in this regard. Those folks were not terribly keen on those bridges, it turns out. And it was a very interesting disillusionment in relation. And then it was at that time in part where I was sort of both building my system and then became very aware of psychology is not like biology in its fundamental organization. Okay. What do I mean by that? If you ask every biologist what biology is, it's the science of life. Okay. There's no real debate about that. And while there's tremendous debate about what is the criterion of life, what's a virus alive, where does life come from exactly, how does it emerge, great, all sorts of questions there. But no one really disputes that the general center of the circle that biology tries to define is life. Okay. It turns out that there is enormous disputation and fundamental disagreement about the epicenter of the circle that psychology tries to box in. And it's that discovery that is the fundamental essence of the problem, and deciphering what those areas are is key to solving it, or at least creating a metapsychological frame that's up to the task of sorting out the radical confusion that resides in our field in terms of this. So, as I started to explore this, I got more interested in theoretical psychology. And here's the thing, folks, that haunts me as an educator. Everyone knows this at one level, knows there's a problem. Okay. I mean, so there's, this has been known in psychology by 1899. The crisis in psychology had already been diagnosed. Okay, so pre the turn of the 20th century, the scholars. So let's talk a little bit about what this is and how to frame this. Okay. It's complicated as shit precisely because the first thing about psychology in a common layperson sense is its everyday life. I mean, folk psychology, right? It's like, hey, why the hell did Andy go do this when she said she was going to do that? Is she seeing my wife? Is she pissed at me? Is she doing this? Why does she do what she do? That's a fundamental question. Ever since we've had this capacity to talk and have shared intersubjectivity, why you do what you do, and wait a minute, how do I do what I do? And what are my beliefs, desires, and what are your beliefs and desires, and how the hell do we get along? Is, that's the nature of being human. So folk psychology, if the subject matter has to do with, hey, human action, belief, desires, how they negotiate and what they do, well, obviously everybody listening to this has been involved in the belief, desire analysis of the people around them since they were socialized to be persons at a very early age. So folk psychology at one level is ubiquitous. Everybody engages in it. You get to become a person, you have to learn belief, desire, narration, and so it's very intimate at one level, which makes it interesting and very ubiquitous then. So then that's one definition for us to at least box off. So there's like, well, this thing called folk psychology. Then you get into philosophy. And so you get the deep history of, I have a book, The Story of Psychology by Morton Hunt. And it just starts with the Greeks, because it starts with basically Western education. And Western education in terms of its, of course, our friend Alexander Bard will bitch about this, but if you go back to the Greeks and you sort of, hey, the first formal questions about epistemology, about human governments, about the good life, the intersection here for philosophers between what is the mind, how do we know, how do we get along, what are we? There's a huge, complicated, and not well segmented differentiation between philosophy and psychology. And certainly somebody like Plato and Aristotle build models of what they call the soul to be ways that obviously are overlapping enormously between what we mean by, in modern day terms, mind, behavior, cognition, things along those lines. Okay. So this is a long-standing concern. Now I want to update us and basically then bring us to what I think is a crucial point about the discipline, which is its intersection. To talk about that's the problem of psychology, as I mean it, we have to talk about science, okay? Because the nature of the problem intersects deeply with the nature of modern empirical natural science and its evolution. And so modern psychology really gets its identity, or at least the identity that we need to struggle with, is what's its proper relationship with this thing called science. The actual term psychology officially dates to the mid-16th century, and is probably the most common cited sort of usage of the term. Is interesting to note. This guy, Rudolf Goclenius, the elder, I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but in an academic book in 1590, he gave a book title that translated in English is Psychology, that is on the perfection of man, his mind, and especially its origins. That's the first 1590 book. It shows up in poetry by this other guy, Italian guy, 50 years earlier or so. But in terms of scholarship, so just to give us a location, this is Galileo, Descartes time period, right when the Renaissance Enlightenment is doing its thing. Psychology appears in a particular way in this regard. And certainly there are some developments along these lines. Obviously, Hume, Locke, these kinds of characters philosophically have a lot to say about the human mind. But I want to go from 1590, jump up into the 19th century is really where the field of psychology gets its rooted modern day character. This is where, so it's from 1800 or 1900 to, or 1800 to the 1900 period. Where you see really all of its founding fathers, that's what they were, fathers, but get sort of identified. And so what happens then is during this century, you have a number of different developments whereby the science, of course, Newton, in the development of the physical sciences and the emergence of the Enlightenment, the industrial age, the modern sensibility about reason, rationality, science, technology, liberal democracy, that has now exploded onto the scene, of course, by the 19th century, right? So, I mean, and then what you have then is people basically saying, that epistemology of modern science, modern empirical natural science, affords us a particular way to try to get truths about the world. And people basically then put the modern science epistemology with the question about what is the mind, psyche, soul of human subjective experience, essentially. It's the marriage of that. And what we're going to then see, though, is that never gets clarified about how to take what becomes a very successful system for mapping matter in motion quantitatively, does not actually utilize, it's not easy to then impute upon the subjective experience of being. And the basic intersection is all the different attempts to do that. So I'll pause there and say, basically, so my point is that there's folk psychology, there's philosophy and psychology. We're actually coming back to philosophy and psychology with a meta-psychology view, but modern psychology actually has its historical roots in the intersection of this topic area, which is then going to try to be jammed into a modern empirical natural science epistemology. Does that jive with folks' frames and references in history, or any questions about that? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say also, yeah, the late 19th century, at least in the United States, when you've got William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, James Mark Baldwin, and a few factors just thinking institutionally about what occurred with Baldwin leaving the chair of psychology, the first chair of psychology at the first graduate institution, Johns Hopkins, him being replaced by Watson. Right?
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you take out someone who had a broad, structuralist, comprehensive, metapsychological orientation towards psychology that was developmental and included very strongly this reasons versus causes, and it was the great grandfather, inspirer of Piaget, incredible psychologist, removed. And in his place you put a reductionist who ends up basically working in advertising.
Totally.
And around that same time you got the reification of psychological measurement as a field, specifically wedded to institutional bureaucratic power. And this is a thing that's often overlooked, which is that measurement in the physical sciences, especially with the metric system and the international organizations for the codification of measurement standards internationally, which Charles Sanders Peirce was involved in. He actually incidentally codified the length of the meter through wavelengths of light.
Oh, fuck yeah. I didn't know he did that. Yeah.
Anyway, but the point was that there's major advancements in metrology and the physical sciences, which allowed for a lot of the industrial and scientific revolution and gave us the hubris of thinking like, the Brooklyn Bridge and these other incredible feats. And then we make this thing called the IQ test. The Americans steal it from the French and they industrial strength it, and they tie it to World War I, and they do a whole bunch of other things, which basically give us the illusion that we're measuring the mind the same way we're measuring physical realities when we're not even close, not even close. And when I mentioned about the mongrel concepts and the reification of folk psychological ideas through statistical technique, is just a continuation of that form of irrealist, metaphysically naive psychological theorizing backed by certain forms of naive measurement practice and statistics. And that became early, and it was institutionalized, and it was bureaucratically institutionalized, and it became the one place where the field of psychology was able to contribute to the war effort and to industrial psychology, and a whole bunch of other places that gave the field itself a sense of we matter, where psychoanalysis was this is a little actually more complicated because you're kind of making people unhappy and making them leave their marriages and their jobs, and it's very expensive. And so the massive move towards reifying a certain form of psychological measurement is part of this, and it led to, I think, the fracturing of the field and building consensus around certain techniques for measurement and even certain constructs, which pulled the legs out from the field getting actually a more robust approach. So yeah, I like the way you're characterizing the story. And where we're at now is one where every time someone gets a new dissertation through this, create a new measure.
Totally.
And that measure measures a new construct. And now the mind is just populated with all of these different constructs and all of these different measures, and all of them can be marketed. And now you can come into an organization and sell this thing. And so it's hard. You can't lose the institutional incentive structures that have actually directed the science of psychology in particular directions as part of the historical narrative anyway.
Well, that's a beautiful, thank you so much for that. It makes a couple of key points. And indeed, ultimately, what my critique is going to be is precisely the institutionalization of what I call the Sandcastle Production machine. Sandcastle meaning research production, like on grit or whatever, not to criticize grit in any particular way, but knowing what it doesn't, no, you should criticize. Well,
it doesn't exist. I mean, and willpower similarly doesn't exist.
Well, I witnessed firsthand the branding of cognitive psychotherapy on something like how you treat individuals with suicide attempt, and the entire production of what was called then the founder and father of empirically supported treatment is essentially a production machine for a brand. That's what it was. It was a production machine for a particular brand, and a technology that was for the elevation of this horse race, not grounded in what any normal scientist would basically say, well, we'll start with observation, we'll build models, we'll gather additional data and correct models accordingly. That's not what this is about. It's about fundamentally here, I build a dissertation, then I build a research program, and then I build a brand, and that brand then sits in an industrial complex that needs dominance and competition relationship. This is why I named the first chapter of my book, From Racing Horses. I'm going to race the Beck brand against the psychodynamic brand. Just seeing the elephant, be like, what the fuck are we actually even looking at here in relationship to, you know, these phenomena? And actually, are we actually interested in making sense out of them? Are we interested in promoting technologies that get, you know, publications or whatever the currency is in relation to the academic structure? It's actually kind of horrific.
In order to add to that and converge with Zach, I think in addition to the rise of measurement, which was an aspect of physics envy, and you also have the idea of experimentation as the primary way in which you do psychology, right? And it's an odd move. Again, it's physics envy, because the science that actually starts the scientific revolution is not an experimental science. It's astronomy. It's a mathematical theoretical science that uses mathematical theoretical argument in order to overturn the Aristotelian worldview. I know experimentation becomes prominent with Galileo, but the idea that science should see. So one of my criticisms, and I know you both share it, that's why we're doing the meta psychology, is that until very recently, psychology understood itself as just experimental psychology. Whereas in other disciplines, you have experimental physics, theoretical physics, you have experimental, empirical biology, you have theoretical biology, you even have well-established philosophy of biology. Yet psychology seems, it has a very truncated view of science in terms of, as I agree with that, measurement, but also that all you do to do science is you measure things and then experiment on the things that you've measured, right? And that is such a limited, both historically and philosophically, view of science. So I just wanted to strengthen what you said, Zach, that it's not just sort of physics envy and measurement. There's also physics envy and, you know, unless that all we're doing is measuring things and running experiments. Please note, everyone, I'm not saying we shouldn't try to measure things and we shouldn't do experiments. That's not what I'm saying. But that's not how you that's not how you do science, right? That's a really grotesquely inadequate understanding of science. So I just wanted to add that in.
Well, and this is to Gregg's point that the problem with psychology is a deeper problem with the way we conceive science. And so that same critique could be made of medical science and technological science, where it's like, guys, if you were really doing science, you wouldn't do it just in this narrow area that directs us in the arena of profits, right? You would do a broad search and all kinds of other things. And so, yeah, there's a deeper issue which has gotten into psychology and kind of distorted it and made it impossible to put one foot in front of the other in many conversations.
And this linkage between measurement and technology is unbelievably key to understand the mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms that generated that pull, by the way. I mean, as you know, Zach, very well. I just wanted to re-echo that.
I mean, and it's not just IQ. Like the DSM, for example, is by one conception a massive measurement apparatus that interfaces psychological practice with bureaucratic control mechanisms. Essentially, that's what it was created for. And again, if you're a realist, and which of those constructs actually exist as disease entities, right? You get into the fact that this is a massive simulation of the mind. And yeah, when I started to realize this about the field, as you did, Gregg, I became a little bit concerned because the other thing that happened was, just like the other sciences, which we were so triumphantly wielding in government and military and other places, we started to triumphantly wield psychology in government and industry and military, but it wasn't at the same caliber of other sciences like engineering and physics and stuff, for example. And so we created a lot of problems we're still dealing with, basically, especially look at information warfare, which is an example of that. So yeah, anyway, I don't want to, back to you, Gregg.
So anyway, and then this affords me an opportunity so I can accelerate this, because we're actually hitting a number of pieces that I was going to hit. But here's the point. Your point about Johns Hopkins is really the issues of history and what could have been in relation. But yet John Watson is absolutely the epitome of the physicalist reductionist, both in relation. Basically, what he does is he adopts his initial behaviorism, which, by the way, is very different than B.F. Skinner's behaviorism. But his initial behaviorism is it's a neuroreflexology. In other words, it's a physicalist flatland with an experimental methodology that he then basically is going to pull and parrot off of what he sees as the success of the experimental physical sciences. That is what originally behaviorism is. And it's
could
amazing.
Not be more different from James Mark Baldwin. I mean,
I know that's amazing. Like, you know, in terms
it was largely professional jealousies and other things that got both Baldwin and Peirce out of the American Academy.
That would really be, and of course, yes. And if you know what kind of person Watson was, although his kids end up killing themselves, basically. it's a fascinating, complicated story in relationship to what this means.
He also, he thinks he's applying, but I think from Rescorla onward, we've understood that he massively misunderstood the work of Pavlov and Baldwin.
Oh, completely.
Right.
Yeah, he takes the methodology, and this is the whole. Ultimately, here's what the take-home point, folks, is that what happens to the institution of psychology is the application, the parroting, simplistic application of psychological method to the discipline as its core identity that they embrace and wave out in front of the young undergraduates like myself that says, science is so great, we take this thing and we apply it in a way that helps you understand common sense. And at first, that's a swallowable, hey, okay, great. And then you actually get behind it. And now you can actually see that it's a complete corrupt at its large scale. Of course, there's brilliant examples, and I love lots of psychologists, but its large scale institutional infrastructure is essentially a corrupt methodological application. And if you follow its history, this is why the crisis is so important from my vantage point, is that there was potentially opportunities, seers like Peirce and Baldwin, who could have actually navigated the scientific, humanistic virtue complexity and afforded us a rich synthetic view of the world that enabled us to appreciate this discipline as an unbelievable intersection between the natural sciences, social inquiry, humanistic application. And instead, what happened was the paradigm wars unfolded in the first part of the 20th century. So you get a paradigm war, you have it's useful just to know the history. So out of psychophysics, Helmholtz and the idea of yoking a sensory experience with absolute just noticeable different absolute thresholds, Weber's law shit. Then you get the Wundtian German idea that we should look, and Wundt was a fascinating character. I think people underestimate how sophisticated he was. He actually divides psychology up into the experimental analysis of introspection, of what subjective experience is, and then Volcker psychology or folk psychology out here. And then he tries to bring into the lab the analysis of his definition of psychology, which is human subjective conscious experience of being, okay? And the Titchener, his student, picks that up, and in the United States, structuralism gets instituted. Now, the point I want to make here, and this goes back to all of our conversations, John, about what is consciousness, the subject matter here, what is psychology about, is actually very well defined in structuralism. It's about human subjective consciousness that no one else can see. That's the topic of what it is. Okay, what I would call mind two. But it's actually well defined. It's not about animals, and it's a science, and it's a science of training people to look at the structure and then delineating the parts that make of qualia, that he would use that term, but the qualia that make up the term. 45,000 different things are identified, and apparently these are the Lego-like ingredients of qualia that make up the capacity for human experience. At least that's the enterprise of Titchener. Okay, that's structuralism. And that comes off of psychophysics. Then you get the evolutionary functional view that gets embodied by James, which is by far the most sophisticated, in my opinion, holistic potential view that really psychology should be about mental life and the ways in which complicated conscious organisms, animals of all sorts, and of course humans, functionally adapt to the situations they find themselves over time. And James affords us I think the richest, if you're going to read one book in the history, Principles of Psychology coming off of James, is probably the book you choose, in my estimation. But functionalism, notice the difference. Functionalism can be tracked from the outside, although James did anchor it to a conception of the mental tightly wired to consciousness. but it's certainly the way animals adjust. That's very different than the inside view of that's only accessible through introspection. So structuralists and functionalists didn't agree on the basic domain of subject matter. They might have been able to get along, but then what happens is you get an infusion of experimental methods, okay, people like Ebbinghaus. You get an institution of behavioral stats methods from people like Galton, and then that becomes the behavioral science industry of statistics, okay? So you get that methodological development. You then get two other, at least there are really more, but for simplicity, two major additional paradigms that are actually one of behaviorism. We already talked about that, which is basically, hey, there's stimulus reflex in a physicalist environment that experimentally analyzes. And then, of course, there's Freud, who separates off of James and basically is like, oh my God, we are concerned with neuroticism and suffering. We're concerned with massive philosophical big picture views. And there's an entire domain outside of consciousness that appropriately gets labeled as mental and drives the shit out of people to do crazy things. And that's would be our focus, okay? So consciousness only available through introspection. The function of behavior in particular from an evolutionary adaptive route, okay? That's consciously driven. The underneath of that drives psychopathology and the observable behaviors that we can create stimulus response relations with, okay? So at the paradigm level, those are the tools, the assumptions, the language of the territory, the arena that people are trying. So they're spectralizing radically different things that cannot commute. And to the point, by 1899, people have pointed this out in German. I don't have an actual translation of Wheely's book, but I have Vygotsky, and in fact, by the 1920s, this is well known. I'll just read you a quote from Vygotsky, so I think it's fascinating. So 1927, the crisis of psychology is lately more and more voices are heard proclaiming that the problem of general psychology is a problem of the first order. What's most remarkable is that this opinion does not come from philosophers who have made generalization of their professional habit, nor even theoretical psychologists, but from psychological practitioners who elaborate the special areas of applied psychology. And then he goes on to say, they completely are pointing out that we're talking about different things. To take the mind, meaning he means conscious mind, the unconscious or behavior as the primary concept implies not only to gather three different categories of facts, but to offer three different ways of explaining these facts. We need a coherent path forward, and ultimately engenders what would become Russian activity theory and a whole nother theoretical structure. Okay, and that's actually Russian activity theories. Vygotski's unbelievably fascinating in terms of its own view. But American psychology, okay, has these schools of thought. 10, 15 years later, what you get is the crashing of behaviorism and the emergence of the cognitive cluster. Okay, you get cybernetics so by the 1950s, you get the emergence of information theory, artificial intelligence, these kinds of issues. And you get a weak computational version of its mind is some kind of information processing system that gives rise to what will become the cognitive sciences, okay? It undercuts the behavioral view, all right, in the sense that the behaviorism trying to dominate. And then what you get is an eclectic empiricism, okay, whereby the field then says, hey, what are we? Here's what we are. Where the science of behavior and mental processes defined as follows. Behavior is what's accessible via the external observer. That's actually how it gets defined. In other words, the epistemology, the position of the observer affords you the way to define what behavior is. And then mental processes are essentially inferred, okay? And that's what's called methodological behaviorism, technically. And what it is, it's an institution of the methods of behavioral science to try to decide what the mind is, which, by the way, by definition, you can't observe. I mean, there's a wonderful quote here. Here's a last thing I'll do, quote, and I'll shut up. The word psychology is coined at a time when concepts of soul and mind were not clearly distinguished. The root ology denotes scientific study of. Scientific psychology refers to the scientific study of the mind. Since science studies only observable phenomena and the mind is not directly observable, we expand this definition to the scientific study of behavior and mental process. Okay, so there you go. Basically, we're going to carve behavior based on an epistemology, okay, of accessibility, infer mental process, and make very interesting claims like, hey, you can't observe mind? I thought that's all I could observe. Okay, and with no then qualification about what we actually mean from a scientific third-person epistemological perspective, as opposed to a first-person experience of being in the world, right? Phenomenologically, you could argue that all we see is mind. And then what it does, all the institutional textbooks then go, hey, what makes our game crucial is that we learn to play the rules of science. We learn to objectively study and measure things. We learn to experiment on things, and that affords us a transformation in knowledge away from your folk understandings of the world. And that is what the mainstream academic psychology gives us and tells kids that this is the way we're going to advance our knowledge.
That was great.
So anyway, to me, the issue is this is like, okay, so what's the proper frame of reference in regards to this? That fundamentally is what I want to be clear about. And what I want to be clear about is that what we have done is we've taken the epistemology of science, a third-person exterior review that tries to create intersubjective agreement through quantification, and have then decided that that is the definition of our field, when in fact that's actually just the definition of empirical epistemology. We can't really define a field that way. That's the position that I want to problematize psychology. I certainly can then dialogue and can articulate my own framing on this. But what I want to say is that I think that for psychology to be coherent, it needs to be connected to the scientific enterprise. People have basically tried to do that. There were all sorts of competition. It fell apart. It created empirical eclecticism. That's basically a methodological behaviorism. When you look out at the knowledge that it's supposed to produce relative to what it's producing for the citizens, for the time, I think we can do a hell of a lot better. I think there's a fundamental problem with it.
So Gregg, I heard you saying, I mean, I'm trying to make sure I'm getting like you pointed, I heard clearly at least two fundamental problems. But they're bound up together. One is, look at this as fragmented. It doesn't have an integrated ontology. It's like, this is like different cultures. They have different entities. They use different measurement methods, right, etc. They talk about different things, right? And I'm very familiar with this. This is also the problem that cognitive science takes as its central problem, the fragmentation of our discourse around what the mind is, right? And so, but I knew about that problem as the fragmentation of psychology. So that's, and you put your finger on that. But then you've also said towards the end, but there's a category mistake, that psychology attempts to solve the fragmentation problem, not by providing a unifying ontology, but by latching onto a generic methodology that is in no way specific, by its own admission, by its own project, is not specific to the mind. It's the same methodology we use for physics and chemistry and meteorology, but we're just applying it to this thing, the mind. But we don't have an ontology of the mind, but what holds us all together, and that is that we use this method. But your point is that's a category mistake. That is a generic method that can in no way specify what psychology is as a distinct science. And those two problems are, so there's a fragmentation problem and there's a fundamental category error problem. Am I hearing it correctly?
100% correct. Yep. And I'll add, the thing that frustrates me is that this is not hard to see when you learn how to see it. Many people have actually seen it, and the field hides it.
Yes.
It doesn't come out. Like I said, how many people know about quantum mechanics versus general relativity? Well, anybody with a first, initial understanding of history of physics and anything, the first thing you learn in the 20th century at overflow, and actually quantum mechanics and general relativity, they're really kind of incommensurate. That's a great problem. You can decide whether they're working or not. But let me be clear, the system actually doesn't make any coherent sense when you actually put these together. Okay.
Yeah.
There are movies about that shit. Okay. We know that the system's completely incoherent. And what do is read every textbook. They're super excited to sell you the method. Yes. And shuffle the actual problem completely underneath the sheets as though the method's supposed to solve the problem. The method's this generalizable thing. So you add to what you said is the argumental problem exactly that I'm making. I just want to add the energy problem that haunts me. Is like the institution knows this and then it hides it. It shuffles it away off the side to maintain rather than being honest about what the hell it actually is doing.
So that brings in then the issue, right? Again, that if we're trying to understand and afford transformation, which is thing we are all deeply invested in as human beings, and especially at this time. And we turn to psychology to give us, right, a way to frame that problem so that we can study and understand it. What we get is a discipline that is inherently fragmented and is therefore consistently speaking equivocally about the mind, if I can use that as a referent term. And when it tries to deal with that fragmentation, resorts to a purely methodological category error in order to resolve it, and therefore can't provide us with any, because when we're just spinning in a circle, right? We're just spinning in a circle.
And this is what's so different about quantum mechanics and string theory and all that stuff, which is that the public's view of that is kind of like it's interesting. It's like some weird mystical conversation, but the downstream impact of that on their everyday life is negligible until some technology comes out that the physicists create, which they don't understand. But psychology is a language of self-description, a language of self-understanding. And so there's something very interesting about the tolerance we have in the culture for incoherence at the level of what is the person, right?
Totally.
That level of disconnect between what's being scientifically stated is the nature of the human and what we're running on, the kind of like the last fumes in the gas tank of the pre-modern life world, which are almost completely degraded by the processes of disenchantment and scientization. Yes. And so the perpetual and increasing fragmentation in that domain, specifically in the humanities, is one of the most disturbing things I've seen as an educator. And now what's interesting is that some of the resistance we have is still, again, something else left in the gas tank from modernity of a resistance to religiosity. Because as soon as you start to articulate a comprehensive enough psychology, someone's like, dude, that sounded a lot like religion, Gregg.
Totally. It's like a religion.
But it's true, because you're like, hey, we are part of this evolutionary process. You left out something in your historical narrative, which was the Piagetian tradition.
Yes,
which is the Baldwinian tradition, which is actually was that sleeping dark horse, which has reemerged as the dynamical systems evolutionary view, right? Which was saying, which ends up being a kind of religious sounding story. It's saying, what do you study when you're studying psychology? We're studying evolutionary patterns that are universal to all of life and matter, which manifest and make themselves explicit in the human mind, and then something new emerges through the human aspect of evolution. And so, there's something about the resistance to a comprehensive story. There's something about the resistance to an emergent meta-narrative that could unify. I remember Habermas, I think, quoting Adorno saying, like, listen, it used to be that ideology, propaganda worked to solidify one view everyone had to kind of like agree in. And there's still some that works that way. They haven't picked up the message. The way it actually works is that now the ideology is the absence of that. The ideology is the continual fragmentation and the inability to learn and transform about who and what you are. And so you're left in an identity structure that is fragmented and confused about very basic questions that humans haven't been confused about when they had basically a common story about the nature of the soul. Now we can take issue with, was it a good story or a bad story? But the point is everyone in this city, everyone in the city basically thinks the same thing. No one's thinking like drastically different things. One person thinking that, well, the way I act is because of how we were on the savannah 10,000 years ago. And someone else thinking the way I act is because of neurons firing in my brain that are ultimately driven by quantum mechanics, which we don't understand. So am I acting at all? And so there's this like, whoa, that's a lot of diversity, and neither of those views are in a coherent story themselves. They're factoid reinterpretations that fragment identity. So it's a deep issue, so I'm not optimistic that the most coherent metapsychologies we're going to get in the near future will come from academic psychology. I think that the most coherent meta narratives we've been getting have come from outside academic psychology, because that's where you're allowed to do things that smack of religiosity. which is again one of the reasons Baldwin was kicked out of the academy.
Yep. Yeah. And as you know, I'm underdeveloped in that developmental track, even though my starting point is with Piaget. But then I get my own histories, I get pulled out into these different paradigms in a particular way. And I actually am sort of thankful I have the developmental complex dynamic system sort of broken into me. And then I'm looking at these, and then I back into the tree of knowledge in a particular, Stone Knight in 1997 or whatever. But the fact of that I need that development is so why I'm so nourished when I talk to you, Zach.
So it looks that in addition to, given what Zach said, and given other things I've heard you say, Greg, that in addition to these interconnected problems of fragmentation and a deep kind of category mistake, it's not just a lack of unity, a lack of clarity. There's also a third problem, which is there's a sort of self-deceptive, self-destructive aspect of what we're talking about here. It pains me to talk about this way. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I love my colleagues. I love the institution I work in, and I want to make that clear.
Me too.
It's precisely because I love it, and also because I have training in cognitive science, that I'm concerned about these issues. But what I heard both of you saying in a profound, like Zach, I heard you say, you said, there's a resistance, but there's also, this weird hunger, right, for an overarching frame. And then you have to play this duplicitous game of doublespeak, if you'll allow me to bring in an Orwellian reference here, right? I heard that, and then, what I heard, I've heard you saying this too, Greg, and just at the end, you said that there's also the institution is caught up in a kind of pretense that is bound up with this, I don't know what to call it, this self-destructive ambivalence. So I think that's, if you draw what you both said together, that's a third related problem. There's a fragmentation problem, there's a category mistake problem, and then there's a self-deceptive, self-destructive pattern at work within the, the field of psychology. Totally. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I'm trying to schematize the problem.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, and then the reason I told this particular history, I think it's a fair history that I'm specializing current slices of. But if you understand the history, or at least the way I would see, then you understand actually the system gets institutionalized. It says, oh, well, there's nothing that really can do this. Okay, the best we can do is apply the method. So now we'll double down on this justification, and we'll push this to this annoying little thorn in our side to the side, and we'll connect with things that need behavioral science methodology. We'll do all of this. In other words, we'll create a cognitive justificatory narrative in relation that pushes this to the side, creates institutional, growth and inertia now, and is fundamentally resistant then to something that would then come. It's already sort of inoculated. Hey, wait a minute, you guys forgot about coherence. It's like, well, only go pat yourself on the little head. We know that coherence is not really that big of an issue. The key is that you're doing science. So in other words, it fundamentally created a narrative already then defending against what is an obvious critique from the outside.
But the point is, what you just said, the fragmentation and the categorical the categorical worship of a method that actually doesn't specify the discipline, and then this self-deceptive thing. I mean, think about how this, right? You said you don't see coherence. Think about how this privileges innovation, right? Right. It privileges innovation over integration. I want to say that again. It privileges innovation over integration, and what you have is the jingle jangle issue in psychology, which we really wrestled with when we tried to get it, and we did it, by the way. Let's try and get a consensus on what we mean by this term wisdom. Let's do something. What a radical idea. Let's get all of the researchers who are sort of publishing on this in one room, and they have to stay together for 10 hours until they try and come to some consensus about what they're talking about, right? But the jingle jangle problem is because of innovation, right? Jingle, I can't remember which is jingle and which is jangle. Jingle is, one of them is where you have two different names for the same phenomenon, right? And so people can study it in multiple domains, right? Or the jangle problem is you have the same name for actually two different phenomena, right? And so you get, you get, and this is rife in psychology. This is well understood, the jingle jangle problem. But I want to point out that the jingle jangle problem is a species of the generic problem of innovation over integration. And the jingle jangle problem and the innovation over integration, independently of your stats and your lab policies, I'm not denying those aren't an issue, but independent of your stats, independent of your lab policies, those two things drive the replication crisis in psychology. They power it and power it and power it. So what I'm trying to say is the self-deceptive, self-destructive pattern isn't innocent. It is finding expression in the replication crisis in a profound way.
Yeah, and it's not unique to psychology. I mean,
no. I only know about psychology.
Right, but it's, you know, if you look at the philosophy of science, especially since Kuhn, right, you see paradigms protect themselves. You know, sciences protect themselves, especially bureaucratized, institutionalized science. I think medical science is an example of this. They have the jingle jangle problem too, and disincentives to create, you know, market niches for innovation, which are really repackaged prior invention. Same thing happens in psychological measures. So there's a similar issue in a lot of fields, which have them locked into basically bad habits. And then there's these heterodox voices on the outside. And then eventually things roll over, but usually it requires institutional change that's pretty significant for that to occur. So yeah, it's quite a vexing problem, I think, at this point.
Thank you, Zach. What I was trying to emphasize, maybe I didn't foreground it enough, is that compare how much of an integration problem physics is facing, because they will foreground, at least to some degree. I'm not saying physics is perfect. I'm not saying that. I'm just making a relative comparison here. But notice that integration is heavily being sought after, and theoretical integration is being sought after, because there is no duplicitous attempt to conceal the fact that there is a deep fragmentation within physics. But psychology, I'm trying to show you, I'm trying to argue these two are the same. But by trying to keep the fragmentation secret, it therefore has to, right, stop people from looking for integration and entrance them with the salience of innovation and incentivize their careers, right? Well, what are you doing as a graduate? Oh, I'm integrating these things together to see.
I'm producing grit.
Yeah. So if you come up with a new effect that nobody else has, then your career's set. But if you take existing things and you put them together and say, hey, I want to show theoretically that these things don't fit together, you won't get a job. You won't get a job. That's changing just recently, but it's very much the case.
That's exactly what my dissertation advisor said, Harold Lightenberg, God love him.
Yeah.
And I ended up having to do a totally different dissertation, but I had the tree of knowledge. He's like, you'll never get a job.
So what I'm trying to say is there's a deep connection between this third thing. So we've got, and they're all interconnected. You see, I'm doing the philosophical thing here. Sorry, but I'm trying to get clear.
This is metapsychology, John.
Yeah. There's fragmentation, there's a category mistake, and then there's self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And what that does is it backgrounds and marginalizes, and I'm even thinking in Derrida's sense, it marginalizes the need for integration, and does that actively by privileging innovation over integration. And that is a powerful factor driving the replication crisis. That's the argument I wanted to make there. That's how I wanted to get that out. Thank you, by the way, for patience. I think
it's a crucial point. And it says there's a deep problem that's self-perpetuating and creates a feedback and it's inoculated. But we can diagnose it by things like the replication crisis, affords us an opportunity to enable it.
Exactly. That's the argument I'm trying to make. Thank you, Greg. You articulated it further in a clarifying way. Thank you very much. That was helpful. How does that land for you, Zach? That argument I just made?
No, it makes perfect sense. So the replication crisis is probably the most well-known place where this is just like, being reported on. Basically, people are being aware that there's a replication crisis, And I mean, I was thinking about how confusing it is if you are trying to make sense of who you are and your place in the universe, and you turn to the field of psychology. Then I was thinking that the mental health crisis could, at least in part, be driven by the psychologists working to try to stop it. And this is an example of an iatrogenic spiral, which I write about, which occurs in a lot of places where you keep doubling down on the same way of trying to solve this problem, but it's actually that problem solving technique that's causing the problem. So you have reductive psychology, psychological theorizing, confusing people about the nature of their identity. And then as they try to get help about their identity, they go to that very science that confuses.
Well, the primary response to the replication crisis has been what? Larger ends and better methods. I mean, that's been by far.
It's been methodological.
It's been definitely, it's not like, maybe we're on the wrong, it's like more of the same, doc, just keep digging.
Yep.
There have been, I want to be fair, there have been 2 or 3 really good papers published where people have stepped back and said, the replication crisis is not just a methodological crisis, it is a theoretical crisis. And our lack of an integrating theoretical framework is a significant factor driving the replication crisis. But the point that you both just made, that the response to the replication crisis has been a methodological, by and large, a methodological response, and not a theoretical and ontological response, just shows how deeply problematic the replication crisis actually is. I will predict that we will institute all of these practices, and we should do them, by the way, pre-registration, lower p-hacking, all that. But the problem is this, and this is why I predict that won't make the replication crisis go away, because of this deep logical reason. You can always find more empirical confirmation for a vague or equivocal or conflated construct. The fact that you acquire more empirical confirmation means possibly two different things. You're on the right track, or you have a theoretical mongrel. And just getting more does not distinguish between them. I want to say that again. Just getting more empirical data does not distinguish between those two. We are entranced by, I refuted the null hypothesis. Big deal. You have another hypothesis you have to worry about, which is your empirical confirmation pointing to a truth, or is your empirical confirmation pointing to a very poorly formed theoretical entity? Because it could equally be both. Sorry, but that's just why people will not step back and gather more data is not going to be the answer. The replication crisis is not, again, one more time, I'm not saying don't do this. Do this. Pre-register, improve your stats, blah, 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 blah. Do all that. What I'm predicting, science, I'm predicting that will not ameliorate the replication crisis on its own. That's what I'm predicting.
Amen. We need meta-theoretical, meta-psychological analysis. So,
because the logical point is just like it's undeniable. Yes, one explanation for why you're getting more data is you are actually confirming something. The other explanation is you have an equivocal, conflated, or vague construct, and that will always acquire more and more confirmation.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's also the case that doing the same study again with a measure that isn't well built, you can get the same result and not understand why, because you don't understand really what you're measuring. You're just measuring a proxy. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, and not to mention the normative issues, which we've been addressing, which are basically not even handled by the vast majority of psychology and aren't amenable to scientific, empirical, or let alone experimental. So yeah, the situation with psychology, I think, is interesting. Like, I believe that current technological trends with the pandemic and geopolitics are going to put increasing pressure on the field, and to prove its worth. And the concern is that we're going to end up seeing, as we are already seeing, partnerships between very large technology companies like Google and people who innovate constructs like grit. So this is happening. And so what you end up getting is the codification of these ridiculous psychological constructs get codified algorithmically within the back ends of the technologies that end up driving a lot of our behavior and create the educational and socializational environments. So as abstract as the conversation seems, it's actually the case that right now we're taking psychology as it exists and interfacing it with the most unprecedented information technologies ever created. And most of the people making that interface are naive about the things that we're talking about and take a construct like grit at face value.
Because they only look at the amassing of empirical data. We have,
Right.
Baumeister and by the way, Baumeister is in many ways a good psychologist,
Agreed.
right? But his notion of will, and he and his students were able to amass all of this data about willpower, and it fits in with the whole Christian idea, and and then it turns out it completely disappears in the replication crisis. You can't replicate it, and people, right? There, like, if you look carefully, first of all, given the fragmentation of psychology, the replication crisis is not equally distributed across the subdisciplines. So you look at it. The areas that suffer the most are the ones that treat theorizing as something anybody can just do on their own. Whereas the areas of cognitive psychology that are not suffering, for example, and I don't think this is a coincidence, the replication, the way they're being suffered in social psychology, is precisely those areas that have a more explicit and richly developed philosophical tradition, and therefore have much more theoretical debate going on in them. And that's not a coincidence. That's not a coincidence. Again, I'm not saying cognitive psychology doesn't have issues. I'm making a comparative point here.
No,
not an absolute
legitimate
point. I'm saying look for where it is. And I guarantee you, it's not because the stats and the methodological experimentation in social psychology is rabidly inferior to what's going on in cognitive psychology. That's not the difference. That's not the difference. It's because the way the construct, cognitive psychology, you're doing work on rationality. They have to read philosophy. They can't not do it. And so you get like the rationality debates, significant, huge debates within psychology about rationality, and experimentation and theoretical debate are woven together. You don't get that in other areas of psychology. And so again, we have to be more sorry, I just wanted to be clear that I wasn't tarring all of psychology with the same brush.
Right. No,
I want to say that there's if we could make this meta psychology, if we could make the discipline more self-reflective and say, stop pretending this is, and actually carefully look, where is it worse? Where is it better? Why? Nobody's doing that. I have not seen a single paper that has said, have you, Gregg? Have you? About the replication crisis, where they say, here's differences within psychology.
I've seen it alluded to. I haven't seen it analyzed systematically.
Yes, exactly. Everybody
you have to control for funding. You have to control for funding, because neurosciences, cognitive sciences get a lot more money than, for example, developmental psychology, which would be my field. And then there's also fields that don't do experiments, like observational clinical study.
Yeah.
So but I completely agree with you. But it's not clear why the terrain of science is the way it is. And again, and I'm biased because I'm a developmentalist. When I've spoken to cognitive psychologists, I've been surprised, for example, at their inability to theorize rationality developmentally. And there's a whole literature there.
I was saying I wasn't speaking absolutely. I did want to qualify that. I think, for example, we're going, maybe just to bring to your point, we're now going through what's called the second rationality debate, because people from cognitive science are bringing in the embodied, embedded, dynamically developmental aspect, and said this was not being discussed in the first rationality debate, right? That presupposition is now being actively challenged, right? And so again, I'm not trying to say that cognitive psychology is perfect. What I'm saying is I can see these moves, even a theoretical debate, and then a theoretical debate about an earlier theoretical debate happening here, and I don't see it in other areas. And I could be wrong, okay? First of all, I could just be wrong. But I know, and Gregg, back me up, anecdotally, people are saying there's different areas are going through the replication crisis to very significant degrees. And just looking at it, as I've looked at it, it seems to map on to how self-reflective and how theoretically oriented that subdiscipline is, as opposed to how much it's about amassing empirical data and coming up with innovative new effects and constructs that's driving the discipline. I could be wrong. I'm willing to admit that right here. But my point is, whether or not I'm wrong or right, why isn't that being investigated?
It's fascinating.
Why isn't that being investigated? What seems to me, isn't that a reasonable response to the replication crisis? Is it univariate, or is it multivariate? Is it happening, homogeneously, or is it happening? what? We're not even doing that. We're not even doing that.
Is someone replicating the work that was done on the replication crisis? Because I don't know if I trust that work.
It is a bit of an infinite regress at one level.
Everything I just said, by the way, well, again, I want to make it clear, and I'm sensitive to your point, Zach. I'm not trying to say that cognitive psychology is not problematic. It is. What I'm trying to say is, I'm trying to make an argument for why we need a metapsychology. And one of the things that metapsychology does is exactly this kind of deep, reflective self-criticism.
Mm-hmm. Amen. So I know we're getting near time, so I'll just offer a few kind of final thoughts, at least, that I wanted to bring to bear on this, and then we can, see where our next moves are. But I think I really appreciate the passionate dialogos around this issue. We obviously all feel it in our hearts. This methodological solution to the problem is clearly not adequate.
Not enough.
So what I would like to say, then, yes, the field is committed to a methodological behavioral approach. Well, at least 90% of it, 95% of it. You have over here this radical behavioral approach of B.F. Skinner. It's 5% of the discipline or whatever, but that's where the mainstream is. I would like to suggest a metapsychology. You'd say, wait a minute, what are the metaphysical issues that we are dealing with? Okay. And that's not highfalutin. That's like, okay, what are the concepts and categories and generalized worldview? I think we could all agree that, hey, science has laid out a naturalistic, emergent, evolutionary picture, big history kind of style at the very least. There's some big bang. There's some simpler dimensions of existence or less complexified systems that then get built upon in relation. And then, so I would argue that, hey, we need to start with that kind of descriptive metaphysics into an ontological view. The tree of knowledge then affords, the argument is that it's an updated map of big history. And what big history misses is the proper cleaving of complexification across the information processing communication lines. So everybody gets the difference between matter into chemistry into life, where that's a gigantic jump. But systems don't hone in on the emergence of the nervous system, at least big picture systems, and the shift in the living kingdoms from the animals that have distributed neural networks like jellyfish into complex active systems. At least many don't. Okay, some certainly do. But I would like to suggest that the dimension of mental, consistent with William James's notion of mental lives, that dimension of mental emerges out of the living world at the animal level. Okay, and we can specify that it has key ingredients: complex active bodies, brains, and nervous systems then afford exemplars of complicated animal behavior, which I then want to describe as mental, which is another layer of adjectives on top of the living. Okay, so that if we had categories of things like, okay, 3 cats in a tree, one's dead, it falls, hits the ground, that's physical behavior. An anesthetized cat falls, it hits the ground, doesn't move, but inside is biophysiological behavior. A living awake cat drops, hits the ground, and takes off. Okay, the complicated actions of that animal behavior are the way I want to frame a third dimension of complexity that comes out of life, and call that capital M mind, as a technical neologism that other people sort of use, but to make it clear that animal mental, complex active bodies of animals behaving on their environment, mediated through the brain and nervous system in a particular way, affords us a particular way of thinking about a particular kind of behavior that's not well described with the term behavior. Okay, so behavior becomes a term in psychology that actually, because of Watson, is confused. Ontologically, it's physically reductive. Epistemologically, it's from a Wilberian perspective, we can say it's from the exterior as opposed to the interior. That's the epistemological difference. Okay, you realize that actually the concept of behavior stretches all the way throughout science. Okay, behavior is used by the physical sciences, the chemical sciences, and actually it's different kinds of behavior in nature. And I map that through the periodic table of behavior, arguing that there are these different dimensions: matter, life, mind, and culture, different part, whole, group relations across scale, that's particle, atom, and molecule, across then scale all the way up to, say, galaxies. and then you do gene, cell, multicellular organism across colonies, and then neural networks, animals, groups of animals. Ethology is, and comparative psychology is this column, cognitive behavioral neuroscience at the animal mental level. And then finally, you get us at the primate into hominid, into human cultured person level. And because we add the dimension of justification, language, propositional knowledge on top of that. And what that affords then is what it says is, hey, behavior and mental processes is horribly complicated, defined epistemologically through science. This affords us a descriptive metaphysics that identifies the ontology of the mental first at the level of mental animal behavior. Then that grows from things like crabs and insects all the way up to primates. And then we jump into human culture person behavior mediated by propositional language and the evolution of culture. If that's accurate, it means there's a radical field difference between animals and their mental behavioral processes and humans and our mental behavioral processes, which I don't think is too terribly radical. But what it means is behavior and mental processes that are fundamentally different at the comparative animal level. That's one ontological field of mental. And then the human justifying socialized creature that's reflecting on where the fuck we are and what does it mean to explain ourselves in this particular way. That's a whole nother dimension. If you buy that basic dichotomy, what it means is psychology is completely split then across those fields. And it needs to identify itself as either just being with the human and leave ethology to some other discipline, or in my preference is, hey, comparative psychology is really the base of psychology, basic psychology. It blends into the natural disciplines in a particular way. And human psychology is where we need to create a particular cleave. And then human psychology becomes a sub-branch. Human psychology is a radically different field. And that interrelation between basic and human as a way of categorizing from the natural sciences, then getting situated into the human and recognize that the human's actually a radically different category, reasons, causes, things like that. And psychology then affords a bridge, but also needs to be broken or separated in proper relation, animal to human. So that's what the tree of knowledge suggests institutionally, that if we're actually going to have animal mental behaviors, human culture person behaviors that are on top of that, you differentiate those fields. They have different causal effectual relations. They warrant different vocabularies, different methods, and different identities in relation. That's part of what the unified theory says about what psychology, the institutional identity of it as a science needs to engage in.
So Gregg, I'm wondering about if we can make a bit of connections to the elusive I here, because it can, one thing that a conceptual confusion that I think I could map onto what you just did that we talked about in the elusive I, and I think is pervasive in psychology, is so mind, like when people are looking for mindedness, sorry for that, but right, there's three things that often get conflated, and they're very carefully being now pulled apart and then theoretically integrated in 4E cognitive science, which is agency. So like, as you said, everything behaves. So talking about behavior as something picking out psychology is ridiculous. Everything behaves. That doesn't do anything. So there's a distinction now that people are really pressing on between being a behavior and being an agent, in that an agent in some sense can determine, right, the consequences of its behavior and adjust its behavior to privilege some consequences over the other, because it's ultimately a self-making thing. It's an autopoietic thing. So a paramecium is an agent, because
I call that functional awareness and responsivity.
Right.
That's the way I would frame that kind of behavioral pattern.
But the problem, I take it, is that, right, if we pick that out as what we're talking about when we're talking about mindedness, we get into really, like, because like, do we say that a paramecium has a mind then, right? So there's agency. Then there's something else, which is, right, a level above it. We talked about how this, right, when you start to move into the machinery of the self, where you can start to talk about an agent that is capable, and I want to introduce this because for obvious reasons, capable of self-transformation within its lifetime in order to improve its agency, right? There's a difference there. So a paramecium can't do much. It can modify its cell membrane a bit, right? Compare that to an animal that can learn and develop, right? And therefore, in some sense, has the beginning of this, what we argue in the elusive I, has the beginning of selfhood, right? It's transforming itself in a fundamental way. But then, right, we had this third category, which we sometimes mean when we say mind. So sometimes when we say mind, we mean agent. Sometimes when we mean mind, we mean a creature that is, is on the, way your tenure track. This is self-track. They have at least a procedural sense of self, and then you get an actual reflective sense of self. And then, but there's a third thing, which is person. Now, notice you can't be a person if you're not a self and an agent, right? And you can't be a self if you're not an agent. But those are not all equivalent. And we're not pointing to the same thing. So, this comes up in psychology. Psychology can't tell if it's talking about agents, selves, and in their very broad sense of things that transform themselves and learn in order to be better agents, or persons.
Totally.
Like, look at abnormal psychology. That doesn't, if you drop below the personal level, it doesn't make any sense. What's it talking about? All these people are abnormal insofar as they aren't persons, right? They're still selves, and they're still obviously agents, right? That's at that level. But when we're talking about neuron pumps and, dopamine levels in schizophrenia, are we talking even at the level of agency anymore? You see what I mean? Totally. We're talking about fundamentally different kinds of things in a very, very confused manner. And it seems to me, because you and I, with Chris, we tried to map sort of, the levels of agency, selfhood, and personhood onto the levels of your framework.
And essentially what you get there is one other, I just want to add one additional division. And then there's biological agency at one level, meaning that biological, like my body, is constantly engaged in some kind of functional awareness responsivity mediated through cells, organ systems. Okay. Yeah. And then there's a unique, my argument is that there's a, in a Aristotelian sort of sensory motor way, there's a unique thing that happens when that biological system gets yoked together by a neuroinformation processing system as a complex active body. So the thing that's mediated through a brain and nervous system at the Cambrian explosion gives rise to, it is that, so there's agency at the level of biology. Then there's this animal, we can see from jellyfish to insects, you see a jump in sensory motor complex adaptive behavior. Now, and then I would argue this is actually emergence of, valence qualia, as we talked about in this space. And that actually is the complex adaptive joint point, behavioral investment theory. What's actually happening is the emergence of a nervous system to coordinate the behavior of the animal as a whole. So the behavior of the complex segmented animal as a whole that exhibits a functional motoric response on the environment, that's a different kind of behavior, different kind of agency than we see in. And then if you just wander around, like I take my dog and I'll see the birds and the bees and the squirrels, and they're behaving differently than the trees and the flowers. Although trees and flowers are exhibiting all sorts of complex adaptive structures, the emergence of that animal behavior is a line in the agency that's worth noting. And where I would say is where biology meets psychology is actually, it's in there, that's the line that at least I would offer as a potential dividing line and gray space in between the disciplines.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. What I was trying to do is say that reductionism is an identification. The upper level is nothing but lower level. We're not talking about reductionism. We're talking about what Evan Thompson calls deep continuity. Right? Where there's a deep continuity between being a biological agent and being a sensory motor agent, but they're not the same. You can't reduce one to the other. And then what I was trying to say is, each time we move along the continuum, and we can't do this. But what we can do is say, what's happening is a nonlinear, increase in the importance of development to this kind of entity.
That's a beautiful point.
That was the argument I was making. But as you move up, what you're doing is, it's a continuum, and we can draw lines because we have to for analytic reasons. But what I'm saying is it's a deep continuity, and the continuity is a continuity that is expressed in the nonlinear importance of development to that entity being the kind of entity it is. 100%. That's why tying this all back to development and growth and self-transformation. That's what I was trying to put my finger on.
I appreciate that. I was oriented more on the fine-grained definition of psychology versus biology.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But absolutely, in relationship to now, to pull this back 100% and orient more towards the Zach and all of this other things that we're about, right? This idea of, as these agents emerge, in particular, this hierarchical level, the centrality of development in shaping what it is that you see and the structure functional relation is absolutely the self-shaping becomes unbelievable. The evolution of evolvability, all of that has to be taken in deep consideration.
Yes, exactly. It's not just a quantitative increase of the self-shaping dimension. It's a qualitative increase.
It's a whole nother
yes,
ball
exactly, game. Exactly. That's what I'm trying to put. And the
Beautiful.
fact that we can't, the fact that we can't properly situate development and transformation into our ontology, I think that's what I'm trying to.
That's a wonderful point. To wrap up in terms of why psychology is not adequate to the task, why we need a new metapsychology, how it might afford us a proper framing, ontological framing, situate us to be able to talk effectively and wisely about human development transformation.
I think that psychology has to be centrally about development, dynamical development, self-transformation, self-shaping. I mean, that's what it needs to be about.
Maybe we can rediscover the path that could have been through Baldwin and Pierce.
But it has to do it properly. It has to do it in deep continuity with this whole. I mean, you've got basically, and I mean this as a compliment, you have an Aristotelian ontology. It has to do it in the light of the continuity, right? Sorry, I'm just repeating myself. I want to hear what Zach has to say about the argument I tried to make about these entities. What we're actually talking about is quantitative and qualitative importance of development in specifying the nature of these entities in an Aristotelian fashion.
Yeah, I mean, the whole time you're speaking, I was thinking of the root of so much of the developmental tradition in psychology in the epigenetic processes of embryology in particular. And what's interesting about the embryology is that you're naming all these different layers and strata of ontology in mind. You were and are all of those levels.
Yes.
You were a single-celled being.
Yep.
And then you differentiated. And in the process of embryology, you see the kinds of differentiations of function and then reintegration of meta function and the kind of hierarchical integrative structures that you see in epigenetic processes developmentally in general. And then all those lower forms of knowing are within the human body now. And this is, again, when you get back into the kind of like a good psychology ends up having a religiosity, you end up saying things which are said in the religious traditions, which is that you are one with everything, that the mineral, the plant, the animal, the mind are all contained within the human, is correct, and a kind of an esoteric truth, that we are every age the universe has ever been. Right. We're also
that's well said.
We're also every age we've ever been. Like little Zach is still in there, as is the basic responsiveness of each single cell in my body to sunlight, for example, which I don't control that reaction, but I benefit from it, and I organize it up into agency and personality. So I think next time I will take the reins and I'll be looking basically at this tradition of thought. So I'll bring in some of these metapsychologies from the developmental tradition and then segue into the conversation about transformation, specifically this problem of teacherly authority, which is one that's close to my heart. And it allows us to reframe a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, I think, and especially bring things to bear in some really concrete situations where we need to figure out how the mind works so that we can advise somebody about a preferable or not preferable course of action, basically, which is at the end of the day what we need to do with psychology in many ways. I enjoy this, guys. So
great. That's a wonderful thank you, guys. I appreciate it. You guys were beautiful interlocutors as always, and I appreciate it.
So thank you very much, and I'm going to end the recording and look forward to seeing the rest of you on the next episode, in which Zach will take the lead as he has foretold.
Yep. Next week, same time. Yeah.